Picture this. God is taking a group of people to this amazing destiny that He has for them. Now, along the way, He has repeatedly assured them of how amazing it is. He's also, along the way, over and over again, displayed His miraculous power on their behalf. But, as we'll see in a moment, they don't understand why it's happening the way it's happening. They had a conception of how, as we all do, how it should happen. They didn't get God's process. And so because of that, they over and over, repeatedly refused to really just trust Him. But worse, all they did was moan and complain. Now, picture this. You're the leader God has chosen to bring them into all that He has for them. Welcome to God Powered. Now, we're going to look at what has got to be one of the greatest feats of leadership that's ever happened. And it's one that we don't examine that often. But frankly, I'm putting it in our After God's Heart series. Because the world has a perspective of what leadership is all about, but what we will see from God's perspective, this is what true leadership is. And in doing so, we become a man and woman after God's own heart. So the story is Moses and God's people as He's taking them to the Promised Land. And in the book of Exodus, we see this entire story laid out. Now, God has, for perspective, God has brought them out of their bondage, out of their past, in an amazing way. And as we look at the story, God has brought them out of Egypt, out of their bondage, by absolutely His miraculous power. And then, when they were in danger, when Pharaoh and the Egyptians are pursuing them and they're trapped at the Red Sea, He literally parts the Red Sea so they go across on dry land. Now, you would think that after seeing God do so much, we would automatically trust Him. But the reality is this. We don't. We are so short-sighted. We so quickly forget what He's done. Now, that's not the point of this particular episode. I do want to look at this amazing feat of leadership and the attributes of it that really I believe God is calling you and I to. That these are the things that made this man a friend of God and helps you and I become a man and woman after God's own heart. So what's happening? So God took them out. We've crossed the Red Sea and we're on this journey to what's known as the Promised Land. But from God's perspective, this was the inheritance that He had planned for them hundreds of years before. He had promised it to Abraham over 400 years previously. Now, remember, we will see this at the very end, but Psalms 138 tells us God elevates His word, in other words, His promise. Everything God says is a promise. And He elevates what He says and His name above all else. So He had promised Abraham over 400 years before He was going to take His people into this inheritance. And God is always, always, always faithful. But He's also, along this journey, repeatedly reassured them. He has spoken. He's led them. Remember, He's led them by a column of smoke during the day and a pillar of fire at night. I mean, what more can we ask for? His presence is there. It's obvious He's leading. He continually reassures us. But the reality is this. We look at these stories and we could go, I can't believe they didn't get it. But I know in my life so often, I've done the same. And I'm sorry, I don't want to step on any toes, but I'm sure you have too. Because we have a perspective on how, okay, God, if you love me, you would do it this way. Now, on a very brief side note, and I'm going to redo our series, Leaving Egypt, at a later date, where you can see how God, the process He uses to take us into our destiny. But part of that process, He took them purposely on a journey through the wilderness, the desert, whatever term you want to use, where they would run out of their provision, Why? He wanted to teach them to rely on him. He wanted to teach them about his faithfulness. Because for them to receive all that he had for them in their inheritance, it would require a degree of faith, a degree of trust they didn't quite have. And you can't talk about it. You have to earn it. You have to learn it and earn it through experience. And God had, every time he took them somewhere where there was no food, no water, whatever, he absolutely proved faithful. But again, what we will see, and this is the key part that we need to focus on today in this episode, is they didn't understand. And so every time it looked bad, every time it went wrong, every time it didn't go the way they thought it should, repeatedly, over and over and over, they murmured and complained. They refused to trust him. Now, here's why this is both leadership and why Moses was a man after God's own heart. Why he was a man who was called God's friend. God said, imagine this, God said that he would speak to Moses. Everybody else, I'll speak to them through visions or dreams, but with Moses, I speak to him face to face. That's the relationship he earned with the living God. And how did he do that? Now, one of the things we need to understand is what it means to stand in the gap for others. See, this is real leadership. See, when they would murmur and complain and refuse to trust God, this is when God, in his holy righteousness, would be required to judge them, to deal with it. Now, one of the things we see, Ezekiel tells us, where God says, he calls out, and I could just hear the pleading in his voice as I looked everywhere for someone to stand in the gap. See, God did not want to bring his holy judgment. He wanted to show mercy. And it says, I looked everywhere for someone to stand in the gap, but I could find no one. But in Exodus, now that was in Ezekiel, but in Exodus, what did he find? He found Moses. And Moses understood God's holiness, his righteousness. Moses understood what brought God's mercy. Now, unfortunately, because he understood it so well, one of the things we must understand as we grow and mature, we are repeatedly and increasingly held to a higher standard. See, a child can get away with so much more than an adult. And as we mature in our relationship with God, as we receive more of what he has for us, as he conveys upon us his blessings, his authority, he also holds us to a higher standard. So Moses understood God's holiness and God's righteousness. But before we go further, I want to reference, recently we did an episode here in the After God's Heart series. And we looked at the friends who took the paralyzed man. They did whatever it took. They were not going to stop. They did not let any hindrance, any roadblock, anything to distract them from getting this man before Jesus. But what I find interesting, and I've made a comment which some of you caught. In that episode, I mentioned that, sometimes when people are so hurting, so wounded, so down, they don't even know how to ask for help. Because what we don't see, not saying it didn't happen, but what we didn't see in that story was where he was continually asking them, please don't give up on me. In fact, we don't see him say anything until the very end. We need to remember that. So what's happening? This group of people, they don't understand the process. They don't understand that, yes, God has this amazing future, this destiny, if we want to call it that, for them. All they saw is they didn't like the process. It was hard. It was scary. We don't see how it's going to work out. There's giants. Everybody's stronger than us. See, they wanted God to just clear the path, make it smooth, make it easy. And the reality is, we so often want the same. But God was using that process to strengthen them and mature them so they could battle through to receive what he had for them. And then once they had it, they would have the maturity and the ability to hang on to it. But they didn't understand that. So again, they refused to trust God, and they continued to murmur and complain. And because of God's holy righteousness, what did he do have? He did have, he had Moses to stand in the gap. So Moses, when God in his holy indignation, Moses would repeatedly stand in the gap. Now, reality is, how do you stand in the gap? Moses would do it with his face on the ground before the Lord. And he would repeatedly remind the Lord of several things. And here's what we need to get. For us to be effective leaders for God, leadership is not about casting vision. Leadership isn't about, how great we are. But leadership is about doing all that it takes to help God's people move forward. That's what he's called us to. And so Moses reminded God of several things. Moses would, on his face, remind God, number one, how much God loved those people, in spite of how frustrating they were. Now, remember, and I said this in an earlier episode, and I love the reality of the Bible. Even Moses, who was known as the most humble man ever, the man who repeatedly would intercede on their behalf before God, without their asking, they never asked him to do it. In fact, they rebelled against him. This man was so amazing, he would repeatedly do this. But even he got exasperated at one point, and he said to God, literally, he said to God, do I have to take care of these people? I have to lead these people? He literally said, if this is the way you're going to deal with me, kill me now, because it's more than I can bear. That's how real the Bible is. But again, what we see is they never asked for help. In fact, they even rebelled against Moses, but he would consistently go before the Lord, fall on his face, and he would remind the Lord that, hey, you love this people. You love them. Number two, you called this people. You chose them through their ancestors. And because he understood God's holiness, and he understood that God did exalt his word / promise and his name above all else, he would remind him that you made a promise. When God was so frustrated with people, Moses would be the one that would stand in the gap and intercede on their behalf. Now, because of Moses' faithfulness, and not just one time, but repeatedly, over and over and over, we see a group of people that God was able to continue in spite of their rebellion by not trusting it. In fact, God said that by not trusting me, he literally called it sin. He says, when you don't trust me, that is rebellion. They murmured, they complained, they weren't happy about anything that he did for them. But because of Moses' absolute faithfulness, God was able to take this group of people. Now, it wound up being the second generation, but he was able to take this people not just into the promised land, but he gave them victory over so many tribes, each of which was greater and stronger than them. He gave them the impossible victory. They would have never made it there if it wasn't for the faithfulness of Moses. Now, in the end, unfortunately, as you know, Moses, when he became angry and struck the rock, which is a different story, it's actually an episode we just recently did, he understood why God had to. Why was it God held him to a different standard than he did the rest of the people? And Moses understood. Why? Because he had more authority, he had a deeper relationship with the Lord, and he understood God's holiness. But even in his mercy, what did God do? He allowed Moses to see the promised land, even though he wasn't able to enter in. Why? He falsely represented God. And again, God in his holiness cannot accept that. But God in his mercy, Moses was there with Elijah when they appeared to Jesus at the Garden of Transfiguration. See, God still loved Moses, but that's, again, another story. It's a previous episode we did. But here's what you and I need to understand. For you and I, to mature into all that God has for us to be, and God has called you to be a leader, but not by the world's perspective. And so how do we become a leader who is a man or woman after God's own heart? It's about consistently standing in the gap for those people that God does love. But the ones that don't get it, they don't trust, they murmur, they complain, they want things their own way. But God has still called you and I to be a leader. And how do we do that? We stand in the gap, we intercede on their behalf. And in doing so is one of the attributes that helps us become a man or woman after God's own heart.